That breaking news, President Trump's termination of Attorney General Pam Bondi, his second cabinet shakeup in a month. Bondi is a longtime Trump loyalist who helped defend him in his first impeachment trial. Just yesterday, she was seen accompanying him to the Supreme Court for those arguments on birthright citizenship. But the president had reportedly grown impatient with Bondi's lack of success in prosecuting his enemies and her PR blunders on the Epstein case, including a combative hearing on Capitol Hill. But Pam Bondi leaves the Department of Justice more firmly under his control.
Trump just made one of the most shocking moves of his presidency, and somehow Pam Bondi didn't stay quiet about it. Instead, the fallout triggered a chain reaction that left Washington insiders scrambling to figure out who actually won this political showdown and whether Trump's sudden decision revealed more about his strategy than anyone expected. For months, Pam Bondi was seen as one of Donald Trump's most loyal allies, the kind of political figure who stood by him when others backed away, the kind of attorney general who publicly praised him in speeches and defended his agenda on major legal fronts. So when reports suddenly surfaced that Trump had removed her from her position as attorney general in April 2026, people across the political spectrum started asking the same question at the same time. What just happened behind the scenes and why now? Because according to NBC News and other outlets, Trump's decision came after growing frustration with how key priorities were being handled inside the Justice Department. And even though his official statement praised her as a great American patriot, insiders described a very different atmosphere unfolding privately, with mounting tension over investigations, strategy, and political expectations that simply weren't being met the way the president wanted, which already hinted that something bigger was happening beneath the surface than a routine cabinet reshuffle.
And here's where things get interesting, because Bondi wasn't just another cabinet member. She had a long history with Trump going back years before she became attorney general, including her time as Florida's attorney general when she became nationally visible during high-profile legal disputes involving Trump University and campaign-related controversies that critics later said raised ethics questions after a $25,000 donation from the Trump Foundation became part of a broader watchdog complaint, something factually and multiple reporting organizations later documented as one of the early moments tying their political relationship together in the public eye, and that history meant her sudden exit didn't look like ordinary politics. It looked personal. But the drama didn't stop with the firing itself, because what really fueled speculation was what came next, including reports that Bondi had been under intense pressure related to the handling of documents connected to Jeffrey Epstein investigations and congressional oversight efforts demanding testimony about whether all relevant files had been released, something the New York Post and congressional sources referenced as part of a broader dispute over transparency requirements and subpoenas that Bondi had resisted while still in office, and that tension created a situation where both parties in Washington began pointing fingers, with some lawmakers accusing her of withholding key information, while the Justice Department maintained that millions of pages had already been released and that redactions were legally required to protect victims' privacy, which meant the story instantly transformed from a personnel decision into a political flashpoint. And then came the moment that really pushed the narrative into overdrive, because instead of escalating publicly against Trump after her removal, Bondi responded with a surprisingly measured tone, telling reporters she was eternally grateful for the opportunity to serve, a reaction that confused analysts who expected a sharper response, but also quietly signaled that she might still be positioning herself inside Trump's political orbit rather than outside it, according to reporting from The Times and other outlets tracking the response. And that choice alone sparked a wave of speculation that something strategic was unfolding behind closed doors rather than an outright political breakup. At the same time, sources cited by NBC News suggested Trump had grown increasingly frustrated not only with the handling of investigations, but also with what they described as a failure to execute his broader legal vision inside the department, a phrase that insiders quickly interpreted as a sign he wanted faster movement against political opponents and more aggressive action tied to campaign-era promises about accountability. And that interpretation matched broader reporting from Reuters referenced coverage indicating Trump allies believed the Justice Department should have moved more quickly on certain prosecutions that never materialized the way supporters expected, which turned the firing into something larger than a staffing change. It became a signal about how Trump wanted the justice system to operate during his presidency. But here's where things start to feel almost cinematic, because the Epstein-related controversy kept resurfacing again and again during the same period, especially after Bondi had earlier suggested during interviews that a client list connected to Epstein's network existed and was under review,
only for the Justice Department later to clarify that no such list existed in the form people were expecting, a reversal that triggered criticism from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle and eventually contributed to the passage of transparency legislation requiring broader document releases, according to reporting summarized by The Guardian and congressional commentary. And suddenly Bondi found herself stuck in the middle of a political storm that she hadn't created alone but couldn't escape either. And what made the entire situation even more unpredictable was that Trump himself continued praising Bondi publicly, even after removing her, calling her loyal and effective, while simultaneously replacing her with acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, who had previously served as Trump's personal criminal defense attorney, a move analysts immediately interpreted as a sign Trump wanted someone even closer to his legal strategy inside the Justice Department at a moment when multiple investigations and political pressures were converging, which meant the story wasn't just about Bondi leaving, it was about who was stepping in and what that meant for the direction of federal law enforcement policy moving forward. Meanwhile, congressional leaders from both parties began escalating their demands for Bondi's testimony related to document handling and oversight disputes, with some lawmakers warning that contempt proceedings could follow if cooperation didn't happen. According to reporting highlighted by Oversight Committee members cited in coverage of the subpoena fight, and suddenly the narrative shifted again from internal White House politics to a high-stakes showdown involving Congress, transparency laws, and the long-running Epstein files controversy that has shadowed Washington for years. And this is exactly the moment where public perception started splitting into two completely different interpretations, depending on who you asked, because some analysts argued Trump's decision showed frustration with slow progress on legal priorities, while others believed it reflected a broader pattern where even close allies eventually found themselves pushed aside once expectations changed, something The Guardian described as part of a recurring dynamic involving loyalists who struggled to keep pace with evolving political demands inside Trump's administration. And whether you agree with that interpretation or not, it explains why the story spread so quickly across political media channels within hours of the announcement. Then there's the deeper layer that longtime observers noticed almost immediately. Bondi's firing followed weeks of speculation about internal tensions inside the Justice Department over staffing changes, policy direction, and oversight responses, meaning the move didn't come out of nowhere even though it looked sudden from the outside. And when you combine that with the continuing pressure from lawmakers over document releases and testimony requirements, the entire situation starts looking less like a single decision and more like the result of overlapping political conflicts reaching a tipping point at exactly the same time. And if you zoom out even further, the relationship between Trump and Bondi has always been complicated in ways that most casual observers never fully tracked, stretching back to campaign-era alliances, legal disputes involving Trump-related investigations, and years of public loyalty statements that positioned Bondi as one of the most reliable figures in Trump's legal network, which is why the timing of her removal shocked so many insiders who expected her role to remain stable longer than it did. But here's the twist that keeps people talking, because despite everything that happened, Bondi never publicly attacked Trump after leaving her position, which is unusual in Washington politics where former officials often release statements distancing themselves from controversial decisions, and that silence immediately fueled speculation that her next move could still connect to Trump-aligned legal or political strategy, rather than a complete break from his orbit, especially since Trump himself framed her departure as a transition rather than a dismissal in his initial Truth Social announcement, something the Christian Science Monitor and other outlets highlighted when analyzing the wording of the message. And then there's the timing question that analysts still can't fully answer, because Bondi's departure came during a period when multiple investigations, congressional disputes, and legal battles were unfolding simultaneously, making it difficult to separate cause from coincidence in a way that leaves room for competing interpretations about what really triggered the decision behind the scenes, which is exactly why the story keeps evolving even weeks after the announcement. So when people say Trump freaked out or Bondi struck back, what they're really reacting to is the rapid escalation of events surrounding her firing, the congressional subpoena fight, the Epstein transparency dispute, and the ongoing reshaping of the Justice Department's leadership all happening at once, creating a moment where one personnel decision suddenly looked like a turning point in a much larger political storyline still unfolding in real time. In the end, What makes this situation so fascinating isn't just who left the job, but what it reveals about power dynamics inside Washington during one of the most closely watched presidencies in modern history. Because when even longtime allies can be replaced overnight, it raises a bigger question about what comes next and who might be affected next in the same way. And that's exactly why people are still watching this story closely. Because if this move surprised everyone once, could another even bigger shakeup already be coming? If you think this was the final chapter in the Trump-Bondi story, think again. What do you think really happened behind the scenes here, and who do you believe moves into the spotlight next? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more fast-breaking political stories explained simply.